So, hey everyone, welcome to this first episode of the Universe Within podcast. Just really briefly, I created this podcast. It's something I've been thinking of doing for a long time. Because a lot of this work that I do, that my colleagues do, it's a very intensive process. And when people come down to do this work, they really go through just a roller coaster of a journey. And we really try and kind of pack in as much as we can in as short amount of time as we can to really try and get people what they need, what they came here to receive. Unfortunately, with that, there's often not a whole lot of time for talking, discussing, and learning about things. So what I'm really hoping to do is to create a platform where we can share more in depth about this work. So I'm really looking to bring on the people doing this work, the curanderos, the guides, the facilitators, the teachers, the people who have founded these places, and really bringing on people from all walks of life who are somehow related to these fields to really try and build a platform where these ideas can really be shared and explored and learned in much more depth, because there is just a wealth of information, and I don't see a lot of platforms or really any out there who are doing this. There's a lot of people who have worked with these plants who are talking about them, but I think it's a very different experience of someone who's maybe just working with these plants on their own versus the people who are actually here doing this work day in and day out. And I think there's a lot of voices that really have a lot to say and a lot to share. So I hope you enjoy it. And this first episode is going to be fairly short. I think it's maybe an hour long. And it's really just talking in a really broad spectrum of what is ayahuasca, one of these plants that we work with here, and it's something that's spreading and becoming very popular. And so just to give a little bit of history about what ayahuasca is. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for tuning in. So the question for today is, what is ayahuasca? I would say in its most fundamental sense, ayahuasca is a plant medicine, and probably plant medicines we'll get more into in another episode, just going much more deeply into what does that word mean, what are different types of plant medicines, what does that entail. But for today we're just going to be focusing on what is ayahuasca. So again, on its most basic level, it's a plant medicine, which essentially just means it's a medicine. Like any medicine we take, it has a very specific function, and it's plant-derived. Sometimes that can be confusing because really the vast majority of medicine we take, not only today but throughout time, is plant-based. So there's a symbiosis between humans and the entire plant kingdom. There's theories that humanity only developed because of plants, not only because of plants, but because of the mycelial network, that essentially this plant life is a precursor to humanity. And in a lot of levels, we know this on a most basic level. The things that humans need, food, nutrition, medicine, oxygen, these are things that plants provide. And plants feed off of humans. So when we exhale carbon dioxide, plants take that in and convert it. So even this concept of medicine is often very tricky because often we delineate different types of medicine. We delineate things like food or plants that we may take as medicine or pharmaceuticals. And really on the most basic level, any and everything is medicine. The sunshine is medicine, water is medicine, the air we breathe is medicine, the thoughts we have or we don't have are medicine. But throughout history, plants have played a very important role in being used as medicine. So again, starting from the food we eat, every food has a quality. It's doing something in our body. And that's where things like herbalism began, stemming out of that. How do we begin to treat certain ailments using very specific plants? And here in the Amazon jungle, that's usually referred to as vegetalismo. So the easy way to think about that is herbalism. I take this plant for this condition. Ayahuasca is a unique plant brew because it's considered in a very special category, and it's in a category which is called planta maestra, or a teacher plant. And what that means is that it's one of really a handful, a dozen plants that has the ability to cure, to heal on all of the different levels where healing is possible. And that's often delineated in 3 or 4 levels. One being the physical level, the mental level, emotional level, and the spiritual level. And for many people, healing on a spiritual level may seem a bit strange, but when we get into that, it's actually not that strange, and it's really not that difficult from how most of us actually see the world anyway. So it's one of these plants that has the ability to heal on all of these different levels. With that, with the teacher plant aspect, not only does it have the ability to heal, but it actually has the ability to teach. It has the ability to actually affect our understanding, not only of ourselves, but of the world at large, and actually really beginning to see how those two things are intricately intertwined. So, ayahuasca is actually a Quechua word. In different languages, it's called many different things. Almost any culture who uses ayahuasca has their own name for it. Ayahuasca just happens to be the most predominant name because Quechua is the most predominant language that's spoken. It's almost like a lingua franca. It's a language that was used to communicate amongst different groups who worked with these plant medicines. So it's the most common term for the brew that is ayahuasca. In other languages, in Colombia, it's called yahe. The Shipibo, who we're working with here, they refer to it as uni. And there's many different names, and we'll go into a little more about the Shipibo name for it as well. The Shipibo are a group who live here in the Amazon, and in the Amazon there's a number of different groups who work with ayahuasca, and they all have their own traditions, their own views, their beliefs, and the ways and mannerisms in which they work with that. So the word ayahuasca, the Quechua word, it's 2 parts. There's the aya and huasca. So huasca is most usually translated as vine or liana, and aya is usually translated as soul or dead. So when you combine those 2 words, it's vine of the soul or vine of the dead. And from my experience, and I think many people who've worked with these plants, there's often a connection to both of those terminologies. Many people, when they work with ayahuasca, they they have an experience that they are they're being put in touch with their soul or their spirit. They're being put in touch with something which is much deeper, much more closely related to who and what they actually are. Sometimes we can get lost in these terminologies like soul or spirit, and they can mean many different things for many different people. So also don't get caught on those particular words. If they don't resonate with you, don't use them because they're not important. But essentially that it's getting us in touch with something deeper in ourselves that's closer to the truth of who we actually are. Vine of the Dead is also very resonant, because many people, when they work with this medicine, they would describe it as a process of dying. There's a process of death. There's a process of shedding away all of these layers that no longer serve us. So that could be beliefs that we have. That could be past traumas that we have, constructs of ourselves, of who we are. And usually it's a shedding away of these things because at a certain point in our lives we realize these constructs we have of ourselves are no longer serving us. They served us at a certain point, but we've come to a place where we realize those things are no longer serving us. And by that shedding away, again, we're getting to more of an essence of who we truly are. Also inherent in that concept of death is what emerges from death. And so what emerges from death is essentially a rebirth or a birth. There's another plant which is very powerful, and we'll have more episodes on that, which is called Iboga. It's another very strong plant medicine, plant teacher. And often traditionally when Iboga was worked with, there are two ceremonies that one would work with. The first ceremony is actually called the death ceremony, and the second ceremony is called the rebirth ceremony. And what de facto is necessary for the rebirth is the death. And the idea of death may sound very scary to people. Why would I want to take a medicine that's going to bring about my death? But I think as one begins to work with these plants, these medicines, that concept of death becomes very important. Because essentially all of our suffering, it comes from these constructs that we hold on to. And letting go of those constructs is very scary. It's essentially our death. We're going into the unknown. The mind is being put into a place where it can no longer grasp onto these things, these ideas of who I think I am. And it's very scary when those things begin to go away, because then I'm left with no self, no construct of self. And that's why these plants are often described in this archetypical way of a hero's journey. It's going into the darkness, going into the unknown in order to be able to emerge from that. Probably better to be left for another episode. So, the Quechua word ayahuasca, vine of the soul, vine of the dead. On the most basic level, ayahuasca is a plant brew. And it's a little bit confusing because often when we speak of ayahuasca, what we're speaking of is the actual brew that's ingested. It's a little bit confusing because ayahuasca is a brew, and it's a brew that consists of at least 2 plants. Normally just 2, but other plants can be added. One of those plants is the vine, and that's also referred to as ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is actually the vine, one of the 2 plants. And the other plant, most often here where we're working, is a plant called chacruna. There's other plants that can be used too, but that's the most common one. So when those 2 plants are combined through an alchemical process, through cooking them down, what emerges then is the brew of ayahuasca. The Shipibo, who I have a lot of experience working with, they have a really beautiful story of relating the origin of ayahuasca. And there's many different stories, and even this story is told in many different ways. So if you've heard a different story, it doesn't mean that the story I'm recounting to you is the absolute truth. It's just one version. And like any story, there's a lot of symbolism in it. It's an archetype. It's something that's designed to touch on certain things that actually get us in touch with the deeper essence of what is actually real, what is true. So the story that I've heard a number of times and in a number of different ways is that in antiquity, there were people living in the jungle, and they actually didn't live in communities. They lived isolated in family units dispersed throughout the jungle. And there was one family who was very connected to plants, to life, to the natural order and harmony of nature. And it was a father, the mother, the husband and wife, and they had 3 children. So one day in a dream, the father had a premonition. He was told that he was going to die. So he told this to his family, and his family said, "No, father, husband, you're young, you're strong, you're healthy, everything's going to be fine." Sure enough, he ended up dying. Before he died, he asked his family, instead of disposing of his body in the traditional manner, that they actually place his body at the base of this particular tree. So they honored his wish, and they did that. Some time went by, and then the mother had a very similar premonition that she too was going to die. She told her family, and her children said, "No, mother, you're young, you're strong, you're healthy, everything's going to be fine." Sure enough, she also died. She also asked her children to, again, not dispose of her body in the traditional manner, but to place it, again, at the base of this tree next to her husband, their father. So the children honored that wish. Because then they had no parents, they went off to another place in the jungle to live with relatives, and many years went by. And after a certain point, the 3 children, also in a dream, had a revelation, a message that came to them that they needed to go back to this tree where they had laid their parents to rest. So they did that. From the spot where they had laid their father was this vine growing up this tree. And from the spot where they had laid their mother was this beautiful bush, this beautiful plant growing out of the ground. And they were told that they needed to take this vine and the leaves of this plant, combine them, and ingest them. And they did that. And through that was actually the beginning of this medicine that's called ayahuasca. And for me, that story touches on a few different points, which I think are quite important and quite beautiful. One is that the actual plants, the medicine plants, they weren't just kind of in the jungle somewhere. They actually arose out of the bodies of humans. So that, again, there's actually this symbiotic relationship. The plants arose from the body of humanity. There's even a bit of a Christian sense in that. The sacrament, the blood or the wine of Christ, or the when we go to church and we take I forget what it's called, but the little the bread thing, and we put it in our mouths. That's also, it's that symbolic thing of it's actually the body of man. It's the body of humans, and we're ingesting that as a sacrament. It's also interesting because in many indigenous mythologies in the Amazon, they would say that all medicine plants actually were put there by humans, that essentially the jungle is a huge cultivated garden. And that also may seem a bit strange, because many people have the idea that the Amazon jungle is kind of this pristine forest, and it's never been touched by humanity. But actually, the what seems to be emerging over the last few decades is a very different view of the Amazon, that actually there used to be very large groups of people living here, actually civilizations, and that these people actually managed the jungle through gardening, through actually changing the physical landscape of the jungle to suit their needs. Interestingly, as they're clear-cutting the jungle, they're finding these remnants through lines, through structures, that at one point there were many, many people living here. And so again, this idea that the humans were actually the ones who systematically placed these medicine plants all over the jungle, that it's not just random. So even with the ayahuasca vine or the chacruna plant, it's not that they're randomly found throughout the jungle, it's that at some point a human planted that there. Another really interesting part of that story is that the knowledge of what to do, how to work with these plants, actually came through the dream space. And that's a really powerful metaphor, because really this work of working with any plants is for me, it's really going into the dream space. And for some people, that may seem like it's kind of taking this work down to a certain level, because often we look at dreams as if there's something a bit insignificant. Even in the English language, we have these terms like, oh, well, you're just dreaming, or that's just a dream, as if it's something that's not important, something that's not significant. But from the shamanic point of view, the dream is tremendously important. Many shamans or curanderos would say the dream world is not only as real as this reality, but if anything, it's more real, because in that realm of the dream space, we're not bound by these laws, these laws of nature, these realities. Because even in this world, we call it reality. And what makes it real are these real laws, things like gravity, time, space, entropy, change. And in a sense, who we think we are, the body, anything, everything, is bound by those conditions. But in the dream space, it's limitless. There's literally infinite possibility. There's access to potentially any and everything. So in that space, there's a tremendous ability to learn, to grow, to heal, to bring the human organism back into alignment. And, the dream space is something that we all go into. We spend, on average, a third of our lives in this highly, highly altered state of consciousness. If I was looking at someone sleeping, dreaming, that person is in a highly, highly altered state of consciousness. Their body is essentially non-responsive. For all intents and purposes, their body is dead. It's laying there, motionless. And yet their consciousness is somewhere else. It's journeying, it's imagining, it's moving, it's changing, it's flowing. And there's a tremendous power to that. Now, most of us, we usually don't remember our dreams, or maybe we remember a little bit of the dream as we're coming out of it. But for many of these cultures, there was a reverence for the dream space, because that's where a tremendous amount of this work happened. That's where a tremendous amount of learning could happen. And so essentially, by ingesting these plant medicines, we're in essence going into that dream space. But the difference is, again, usually when we enter the dream space, there's not a knowing of that. There's not a recollection of that. And with these plant medicines, it's as if we have one foot in the dream space and one foot in this reality. And that's very powerful, because it means whatever is going on in that dream space, we're consciously aware of it in this space as well. And so the teachings, the learnings can actually be taken and integrated then into this reality. Dream space, probably another very good episode. So that's another really powerful archetype of that story. Another really powerful archetype of that story is that often, for many people, when they're working with ayahuasca, there's often this sense, it's been said, that they're working with a feminine spirit, or even in many languages, it's called Mother Ayahuasca. There are some cultures who view it as a feminine spirit. There's also cultures who view it as a masculine spirit. What I like about the Shipibo story is, for me, it's a much more balanced way of looking at it. It's a much more holistic way of looking at it. It's neither completely masculine nor completely feminine. It's actually the union of both. The ayahuasca vine, the Shipibo would call that nishi, it actually arises from the body of man, from the father, the husband. And so it represents the masculine energy of the ayahuasca brew. The chacruna, the bush, the plant, that represents the feminine, the woman, the woman's body. And it came from the mother, from the wife. And through the joining of those two forces, what emerges is ayahuasca, or in the Shipibo language, the name they have for it is uni. And that's also a very beautiful word. And it's often very difficult to really translate these terms. But in a most basic sense, that word has to do with this idea of knowledge, or wisdom, or truth. And it's not a knowledge that comes from picking up a book, or what this person said, or what that authority said, or what I've been taught. It's a knowledge that arises from an experience that's seen and felt and known. And so I think even a better word than knowledge is actually wisdom. And wisdom is also correlated to truth. It's a truth that's seen, almost something that's unshakable. Once it's experienced, once it's seen, it doesn't necessarily matter what anyone says or does or what theories come up. It's known, it's experienced, and that experience never goes away. It's then a reality. So that's a really I think powerful symbol of that story also. Some people often ask, well, why is it often referred to as a feminine spirit? I think there's a lot of different answers for that, but I think on the most basic level, one is simply an archetypical way in which ayahuasca works, which could be seen as potentially embodying more of that feminine aspect of working. The medicine of ayahuasca is very ethereal. There's a dance. It happens at night under the moonlight. It's very symbolic. It's very mysterious. And those are very often very feminine archetypal qualities. And again, it's also important to some degree to delineate between a woman and the feminine quality, because it's essentially just two sides of a polarity, which many women tend to embody more of those qualities, but it's not inherently synonymous with a woman. Other plants may tend to embody more of the archetypical qualities of what we would consider masculine energy. One of those plants is actually tobacco, which we'll have a whole nother podcast on. But tobacco, again, it's not inherently masculine or feminine, but often the way in which it's often described, the properties that it transmits, can be seen embodying more of the masculine qualities. So the medicine is very direct, it's very strong, it's very clear, it's very grounding. There's a sense of power. And so the way in which it works could be described, again, as more masculine. In many cultures, they often refer to it as the grandfather, the primordial masculine in energy, that actually it was the first plant. It was the plant in which all other plants came from. So we'll definitely do another podcast on that, but we'll leave that for now. So from the Shipibo's point of view, they would say that the ayahuasca vine, the masculine energy, Nishi in their language, it's that which gives the effect, or that which gives, in Spanish, they would say the mariación. And mariación, it comes from this idea of dizziness. So it gives the dizziness, or it gives the effect. Also, it could be said, it opens the space, or it holds the space, which again is this masculine principle. The chakruna, or the kawa in the Shipibo language, the feminine, they would say, is that which gives the light. It's that which gives the vision. It's that which allows us to see. And not just necessarily on a visual sense, but the ability to see, to experience, to feel. So many people often say, oh, well, it sounds like the kawa is really the plant that's creating the learning. And that is true to a large extent, although the ayahuasca vine also has a number of properties which contribute to the effect as well. But essentially, it's very much like in traditional Chinese medicine, for example, where they talk about the yin and the yang. They say that the yin is the effect. It is that which moves and works. But it's really important that the yin never overcomes the yang. Why? Because the yin can't work without the yang, just like the yang cannot work without the yin. So it's the vine, again, that allows the yin to work, that allows the chakruna, the kawa, to work. So they're both fundamentally vital. One doesn't work without the other. The feminine doesn't work without the masculine doesn't work without the feminine. The feminine has no effect without the masculine. The masculine has no vision, no sense without the feminine. I guess you can also extrapolate that to men and women as well. So that's another really powerful archetype of that story. As this plant or these plants are beginning to be studied more in kind of a Western methodology, really the same thing is being said as to what these indigenous groups are saying, that in the chakruna plant, there's many alkaloids, but the one that's really been the most studied is an alkaloid called DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. And it's a very powerful, there's different words for it, but entheogen or hallucinogen or psychotropic, whatever terminology we want to use, but that it has the ability to highly alter our state of consciousness. Also, that may seem a bit strange, that my consciousness is being altered, but this is something that's happening on a moment-by-moment basis. Our consciousness is never static. Being static is actually what entropy is. When something is static, it's actually dying. Life is actually the state of change, of growth, of expansion, of constantly flowing and shifting and changing. It's something we can see even in water. When water gets stagnant, it's without its life, it's without its properties. And the state of water is to continue to move, to flow, because that's where it has its life. The same with the human being. A human being who's static, there's no growth, there's no change, there's no evolution. So even these ideas of an altered state of consciousness, it's not something that's very foreign to us. Our consciousness is always changing. It's never static. Our consciousness when we're sleeping is very different to when we're awake. Our consciousness when we're in a state of meditation is very different from when we're driving our car. If we're in a fight or a battle, our consciousness is very different than if we're cooking dinner. So what DMT is doing is it's altering our consciousness in a very specific and a very profound way. And it's putting us in a place, again, almost like this dream space where there's infinite potentiality. There's a potentiality, again, to heal on all of these different levels. And there's this potentiality to really learn, to grow, to see, to understand, to let go. The interesting thing about the ayahuasca vine is it contains, again, many, many alkaloids, many different harm alkaloids, but one alkaloid that's very interesting that, again, correlates to what the Shipibo and many indigenous cultures who work with this are saying, and it's called monoamine oxidase, and it's an inhibitor of that. So in our stomach, we have an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. And if we were to ingest any substance that contains DMT, this enzyme in our stomach neutralizes the DMT so that essentially we have no effect. And that's what they're saying. The chakruna, the feminine, without the masculine, without the ayahuasca, it has no effect. So the interesting thing about the ayahuasca vine is it contains this monoamine oxidase, MAO, inhibitor, so that when we combine these two plants and we ingest it, the inhibitor in the ayahuasca vine inhibits this enzyme in our stomach, and it's kind of like two negatives cancel each other out, and then it allows the DMT to take effect. So that's also very fascinating. It's also, I think, really important that we don't get too hung up in kind of this reductionist way of looking at things. Not that that's not useful. It's very useful. The more knowledge we have, the more power we have. But also, there's this aspect that I think is, especially as we begin to work with these plants, one of the things we see is that the mind that tries to know, that tries to name, that tries to label is actually the very thing that's causing us our suffering. And that's not to say that we don't do that or we don't try to do that. It's very important to do that. But also at some point, realizing that there's potentially something beyond all of that which the mind can never understand. In Zen, they often talk about a knife, and a knife has the ability to cut all things. Anything you can cut with a knife. But the knife, the one thing that it can't cut is itself. And it's very similar with the mind. The mind has the potentiality to know all things, anything, everything. But the one thing the mind cannot know is itself. It's the very thing that's trying to understand that actually is the thing it's looking for. Also in Zen, they have a beautiful saying, which is that in order to find, we must seek. But as long as we're seeking, we won't find. So we have to seek. We have to try and know. And yet, paradoxically, there's a letting go of that. So that's the story, or one of the stories that the Shipibo often relate. Also very interesting in that story is that the three children also embody the three primordial levels of the curandero. So the curandero it comes from the word curar, which is to heal. So curandero is one who heals. They would often also use the word medico, or doctor. We're also now shaman, even though it's not a word that comes from here. It's also a word that's used. So some people will refer to someone who works with ayahuasca or any of these plants as a curandero, a medico, a guia, a guide, a doctor, a healer. But essentially, those are also just labels. And I think it's important not to get too caught up in the label of that. Also, maestro, a teacher, that's potentially another label. From my experience, the best curanderos wouldn't even necessarily call themselves that. There's simply a recognition that they have the ability to hold that space. There's a deep trust. There's a deep commitment through their own practice, which is very rigorous, of learning to trust in the medicines, that these plants give us access to something much greater. Whether you want to call it spirit or God or universal consciousness, but through their own work, there's a real trust in that, and that the plants are giving us access to that. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone can just go and take this plant and, oh, well, I just trust in the plant. No. The setting, the skill level of that person is vitally important. We often use the analogy of open heart surgery, that essentially this work, when we're working with one of these plants, it's like open heart surgery. And if you're going to get your heart operated on, it's very important that you work with someone who really knows what they're doing. Vitally important. If you just work with any person to operate on your heart, that would be crazy. So it's vitally important to work with someone who really has a skill, really has a mastery over that. And that skill or mastery comes from they themselves doing that work countless times. Like anything, it's practice and practice, and a journey, an inward journey of inquiring into the self, into the nature of reality. And through that experience, being able to fully trust in what they're doing. So the three levels, those first three children for the Shipibo, the first level was what they would call onaya. And again, there's many different stories to this. So this is also a bit of my own experience relating to these stories, because there's many ways in which these are described. So also what I'm saying isn't the absolute truth by no means whatsoever. It's just from my experience, what I have and am beginning and evolving to see through my own experience. But the first level is what they call onaya, and this was the first child. The first child embodied this level called the onaya, and it comes from the word uni. So an onaya is one who works with uni, or one who knows, one who has wisdom. And this is a very powerful curandero. It's one who has the ability to use ayahuasca, to use uni, and to be able to enter that space and heal and change. The second level was, or is, what's called yobu, or yobohuni. And this one is a bit tricky, because often yobu is synonymous with this idea that we find here in the jungle, which is this idea of brujo, or brujeria, or witchcraft. And there's a lot of thoughts around this. There's a lot of opinions. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this. Some would say, especially in antiquity, there was actual brujos, people who practiced witchcraft and were trying to do bad. But I think on the most fundamental level, it's an archetype. It's an archetype of good and bad. And that we all have that. We all have the potentiality to be a brujo. We all have the potentiality to be a curandero. And this is where integrity is so important, because every action we take, it can be for good and it can be for bad. Every word we say, every action we take, and this is where it's the line, the commitment to be a curandero is very difficult, because also under the influence of these plants, there's an amplification of sensory perception. There's an amplification of of our words, of our actions, of our thoughts. And so to walk the path of the curandero is a very difficult path. It takes a tremendous commitment, a tremendous sacrifice, because anything that's out of alignment is amplified, and it has the ability to then do harm, and to do harm on a much more amplified basis. Now, also in antiquity, especially when groups were living in communities, every group had their own curandero, their own healer. And there was also a worldview where sickness came from another group's curandero, although they wouldn't call it a curandero, they would call it a brujo. It was, sorry, there's a mosquito here. It came from who they thought was someone trying to do harm. And that may sound very strange, but I think we can actually all relate to that. We've all been in situations where we've felt that from someone, an energy or a way that we feel is not healthy, that someone else is operating towards us. Sometimes people are walking down the street and they say, "Ooh, this person has a bad energy," or you meet someone for the first time and you say, that person has a lot of negativity, or there's a lot of anger. And we can feel that. If I'm feeling that someone is very angry at me, that has the ability to affect me. If someone is very jealous towards me, or someone is giving me ultimatums or trying to cause me harm, then that can be felt. And eventually, if those things aren't resolved, it can manifest into mental illness, emotional illness, and even physical illness, and on a larger scale, spiritual illness. So there's the potentiality that there are people who are simply always trying to do harm. And I think there's also the more likely potentiality that everyone has different views. Everyone is looking at something different. And much like if we see this in war all the time, who started the war? One side says it was the other side says it was the first side. Nobody is ever the bad guy in that sense. The other is always the bad guy. And we find ways to justify that. He started it, she started it, therefore I'm going to retaliate. But the retaliation comes and that person says, "Oh, this person attacked me, therefore I'm in the right to retaliate." So the yobu is often correlated, I think, not necessarily justifiably, to the brujo, one who is potentially causing harm. But I think from a more holistic point of view, and the way that I've experienced, and curanderos who I also have a lot of respect for have experienced, is that essentially it's another level of power. It embodies these qualities of warfare, which also inherently means protection. So it's one who has the ability to enter a space where they're fighting off things, or trying to bring peace, or trying to bring harmony, trying to keep the natural balance of things, which is often very challenging. And it takes a tremendous strength, a tremendous power. It's often even going in to what we may call the darkness, to battle that, or to clear that, to clean that. And that can be a very difficult path. I think the plant that was often correlated to that was actually tobacco. And again, we'll talk much more about tobacco in another podcast. But for many of the reasons that tobacco was demonized, so was the yobu demonized. But that actually in those three levels, the yobu was potentially considered even higher than the onaya. It was someone who had the ability to go into the darkness, which is actually where the fundamental aspects of a lot of this work happens. So one way of really thinking about that is the warrior, the curandero who's also a warrior. The third level is what's called a moraya. And again, there's many different ways of looking of what that term means. But most people would agree that the Maraya is the highest level. It's higher than the Onaya. It's higher than the Yobu. It's the ultimate curandero. It's one who's potentially transcended both of those. It's often said they have the ability to transcend time, space, even physicality. There's many legends of curanderos who, for example, were able to turn into a jaguar or a bird, and to work in that way, to work in two places at the same time even. And whether they mean the physical reality or that altered state of consciousness, that's another discussion. But essentially they had that ability. They had the ability to travel towards other realms and to navigate those realms, to other universes, to other cosmoses, and to find order there and to bring that knowledge back and to transmit that. Some would say even that the Maraya no longer needs plants, that they've even transcended that even just their power of the word has the ability to heal. Some would also say that the Maraya is the one who is able to embody both of these medicines, ayahuasca and tobacco, and that they through that they've had a mastery over both of those. So you have stories of ancient curanderos who would go out into the jungle for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 years even, and just be in isolation and just working with these two plants. They would often condense the ayahuasca brew, which is usually a liquid, into a very, very dense, hard substance, which they would often call a chicle, which is now it's like a piece of gum, but it's a very small, condensed, hard piece of ayahuasca, so they could carry a lot of that. And it was very strong, so you would only need a very small piece, and one would be able to go into the effects of ayahuasca, and they would carry their tobacco. And through using and working with both of those plants, and then potentially dieting a tree, which again we'll talk much more about dieting in another episode, but through this process of isolation, of fasting, and under the effects of these medicines, they learn the ability to transcend. Most people would say there are no Maraya left, that essentially that knowledge has been lost, that no one has the ability to do that, potentially primarily because no one does have the ability to do that, or also because no one has the commitment to actually go on the path that allows one to do that, spending that long in isolation. So from those three children, the first three levels of curanderos emerged, and that's essentially the story of ayahuasca. So the next part is, what does working with these plants, specifically ayahuasca, look like? So always these plants in antiquity, there was very much a quality of sacredness around them. Something like ayahuasca wasn't something that was just worked with on a casual basis. There was a very specific preparation, a time and a place that these plants were worked with. So usually when one made the commitment to work with ayahuasca, it came from some sort of calling. It's often said that we don't choose to work with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca calls us. And it's a very common experience that people have. They somehow feel that they're called to work with ayahuasca. And that calling can come from many different reasons, but usually on the most fundamental level, there's usually a sense that something is off, something is not quite right, something is out of balance. We may know what that is. It may be a very acute trauma. It may be depression, anxiety, a physical ailment that we're dealing with. It could just be a really genuine sense of curiosity, of some sense of knowing that life is greater than what I think in my 9 to 5 job, that the daily routine, that something is missing. I sense that there's something more. And maybe we hear about ayahuasca from a friend, or we read about it, and there's something that somehow clicks, a curiosity that begins to open. And eventually it builds and builds and builds, and there's just some sort of resonance that, okay, I need to work on this. And usually when that decision is made, things kind of begin to line up. And that may sound kind of crazy, but if you have worked with these plants, that probably doesn't sound so crazy. Things begin to sort of move and come into place. So as I was saying earlier, it's very important to find some place that you feel called, that resonates, that you feel comfortable working at that place or with those people. Because this work is very, very difficult. And one of the things that's really important to feel is a sense of safety. This sense that I'm going into potentially the unknown. If I'm at all concerned about the environment or the people, I can't really go to the depths that potentially I need to go to, because part of me is still here. It's still concerned. It's still aware of these things that are happening here. So that's where the set and the setting are vitally important. The plants of ayahuasca, they come from this area of what's called the Upper Amazonian Basin. That's where they originate from, and still that's where almost all of it is. There may be a couple places in the world. I think the Big Island in Hawaii, where they're also now growing these plants, but it has a very specific climate and environment. So, even if people are working with these plants outside of this environment, most likely they're still getting the plants from this environment. And it doesn't necessarily mean that by working with these plants outside of the environment, it's not good. But I do think from experience, everything has a place, it has an origin, and there's also a reason why these plants are coming from here. And if we have the ability, I think there is something very valuable in working with that plant in its natural environment. And again, that's something we can talk more in another episode. But again, these plants embody the settings in which they come from. So usually when one begins to work with ayahuasca, the first thing is it's really important to go into a process of what's called a dieta, or preparing oneself for the actual experience. And that usually involves really beginning to restrict oneself, beginning to go on a very specific diet, a food diet, really beginning to restrict the foods that we're intaking, which really has the ability to begin to clean us by simplifying the food, and also beginning to open us. There's also kind of a symbiotic exchange of, the willingness to which I'm willing to sacrifice the pleasures, the things that I like ingesting, that symbolic act of saying, hey, I'm going to begin to sacrifice. There's a give and a take. There's a reciprocity that's being shown through that act. Some of the dieta is also certain foods that may be counterindicated to this work, and that's also very important. Also things like beginning to isolate oneself, one beginning to stop watching TV and not checking our phones so much, maybe beginning to meditate, beginning to connect to nature more, really preparing oneself as best one can for the experience that's going to come. And then there's the actual going to the physical place where the ceremonies will happen, because these plants are worked with traditionally in a ceremonial context. Because again, the ceremony is very important. There's the actual reality of the ceremony, the physical environment, what's actually being done. And again, at an archetypical level, there's a symbology of the ceremony. The ceremony is a very specific time and place. It's a non-ordinary state. And that's very important. And it's not to say our ordinary reality isn't important. It's vitally important. That's where we spend most of our lives. And we literally cannot be under the effects of something like ayahuasca all the time. We wouldn't be able to operate. One of the qualities of ayahuasca is it demobilizes our body. It's very difficult to move. That's where the idea of mareación, of dizziness, comes in. If one has worked with ayahuasca, there's very much a sense of dizziness, of lack of stability, a sense of nausea. And that's a huge part of the work of ayahuasca. But that means we can't be on ayahuasca all the time. You can't drive on ayahuasca. You can't cook on ayahuasca. You can't function for the most part. And that's very specific because it means it's meant to be worked with in a very specific time and place and setting. And so then there's beginning to work with the plant. And that depends on the time we're able to give to it, the commitment that we're able to give to it. And we all have different circumstances. So maybe we're only able to do one ceremony. Maybe we're able to do two. Maybe we can do 5, 7, it depends. In general, if we're able to give ourselves more time, there's a huge benefit in that, like anything. And there's the reality of what can we actually commit to. So here, where I'm shooting this at the Temple of Way of Light, usually we're working between 5 and 7 ceremonies. And it's not inherently a magic number. Some is just the constraints of what people are able to do, the amount of time they're able to come. So it's usually 9, 12, or 23 days. And in that span of time, there's between 5 and 7 ceremonies. And there's a real value in being able to have all of those ceremonies because each of those ceremonies, something different is happening. So, again, this is a bit of a reductionist way of looking at it, and not to get too lost in kind of the rationality of it, but there also is some ration to what's happening. Much like if you go to any doctor, the doctor first, they look at you, they begin to take your vitals, they check your heart, they check your lungs, they look at your tongue, they look at your tonsils. So very much in that way. In the ceremonies, there's a process. Now, the ceremonies are kind of the catalyst, but along with that, there's a lot of other things that are happening. Ayahuasca is again, it can be considered the catalyst, but usually in these systems, again, they're more holistic systems. So a lot of things are also being worked on. So for example, here, we've already started with the process of the dieta. There's been screenings. There's been understanding why someone is coming. What is their intention? What are the physical ailments they're dealing with? What are the mental, emotional ailments they're dealing with? All of those things are really, really vital and really useful information to have. And then once someone comes, there's for example, plant baths. Actually using plants in a bath and bathing oneself with that, cleansing oneself physically but also energetically. There's things like vapor baths, using heat, beginning to open the body up, opening the pores up, and then bringing different plants into the body in that way to begin to clean and clear the body. There's different plant remedies that people can take, actual liquid plants that again begin to fortify the system, cleanse the system, work on potentially specific ailments that people have. There are the curanderos, the ones who are working with each patient, and it's important that they have some understanding of what that patient is dealing with. There's often what's called the facilitators, the people who kind of work as a bridge between the guests that come and the curanderos, one simply to speak the same language, to act as an aid, a bridge, to really help people to during ceremony, to help them through their experience, to potentially help to interpret or guide or show things from a different perspective of what's arising in ceremony. There may be teachers that they're also working with, teachers who may teach other complementary practices like, yoga or meditation or self-inquiry practices or cognitive behavioral practices, anything that can also really help to aid in this work. But the fundamental catalyst, if we're talking about ayahuasca, is the ayahuasca itself. And that happens in the ceremony. So if, for example, one has, let's say, 5 ceremonies, there's a process of what the curanderos are working on and what the medicine is working on. Again, however we want to think about that, the spirit of that plant, spirit with a capital S, God, consciousness, whatever word resonates, that essentially ayahuasca is a medium that opens us to that. And the role of the curandero is to hold the space to allow that to happen, and then begin to work with that, to manipulate it, to drive it, to bring it up, to bring it down, to manage the space, to manage what's coming up. So often the initial ceremony, for example, may be a greeting. We would often say like a gentle handshake, so that the patient is able to experience the medicine, especially if it's the first time, to be able to get a sense of what is actually going on, which is vitally important. To really begin to acclimatize to that altered space that one is entering into, to begin to build a trust, to begin to build a relationship. And then also on the medical side, to see how the patient reacts, to begin to see what their dose is, to see what they need, how to work with them. For the curanderos, energetically, to be able to see, to sense, what is going on with this person. How do I work with them? How do I help them? And then there's a process of beginning to play with the dose, to find the correct dose for each person. And then there's a process of what we could call cleaning and clearing. Much like a house. If we really want to get our house in order, the first thing we have to do, one, is set an intention that I want to clean this house. And then there's the actual process of cleaning, getting down on all fours, scrubbing the floors, sweeping, cleaning, and really getting everything that's old out so that we can begin to bring something new in. So there's first the kind of acclimatizing, then there's the cleaning, there's the clearing, and then there's the reordering. So once some of these base things have been cleaned, how do we then put the house back in order? How do we move pieces of furniture around to create feng shui? How do we move it around so that things flow again? How do we take an organism that is in dis-ease and try and bring it back into ease? Try and bring things back into alignment. Try and put the pieces back together in a way that's in harmony. And that's where often a tremendous amount of the real work comes in. The cleaning and clearing can also be a tremendous amount of work, often a lot of purging, a lot of discomfort, things arising that are maybe very uncomfortable. The putting back together, that's often when we begin to become very introspective, to where we begin to see things in our lives that are out of balance. It could be things with family. It could be actions we've taken in the past. It could be ways that we've been. There's often also this quality of this medicine of ayahuasca of working on past, present, and future. But first, we really need to be able to cleanse the past and to also detach ourselves from the story of the past. A tremendous amount, if not all, of our suffering comes from the story of our past. And then we often take that story and we project it into the future. And this is also the symbiosis. This is the duality of ease comes from a state of presence, of awareness, of openness. But so much of our lives we spend in this actual altered state of being in the past, being in the future. And it's normal. That's the human condition. Every single human being goes through that. And so through this process of reordering, we're beginning to cut the ties to the past, to see that potentially this thing no longer is serving me. This thing is no longer important. Often there's this sense of wisdom from a Buddhist perspective is seeing things from the other side. So while I may have an event in my life that I feel is still affecting me to this day, when I see it from the other side, when I can see it from someone else's point of view, then there's a wisdom, there's an understanding, there's a compassion that begins to arise. And then that story is seen as not being so vitally important. There's a peace that comes with it. There's a letting go. And not that it didn't happen, not that it didn't serve me, but that simply it served me for a while, and now it's no longer serving me, and I can let it go. I can be free of it. And that's part of the death experience, the dying, the letting go. And that can be, it may sound very easy, but it's very, very difficult. Because as we let these things go, the sense of self that we've created is diminished. And then there's a grasping, there's a fear of, who am I now? If I'm not this, and I'm not this, and I'm not this, who am I actually? Who am I? And that can be very challenging. So that's where a lot of this work is coming, is it's beginning to go into these patterns, these beliefs. Even if you're maybe familiar with Shipibo, or if you're not, you can Google and see Shipibo art. It's all of these patterns. And so essentially what they say they may be doing is weaving these patterns back together, because the pattern has become out of order, unaligned, dispersed. And so it's a process of weaving the pattern, weaving the soul, weaving the person back into a space of harmony. And then the final part of the process, we could say, is an act of closure, of bringing the process to a close. If we use that analogy of an open heart surgery, we're essentially sewing the person back up. We're putting the stitches in. We're putting the antibiotic cream on. We're giving them. We're taking away the hospital gown, and we're giving them back their clothes. And with that, there's a closure, but there's also an opening. There's an opening now to a new way of being, a new potentiality. And even from a more scientific point of view, there's been a lot of research showing that that's exactly what's happening. These ideas of neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, that actually these old patterns, these old neural pathways that just keep going in loops, that keep firing, creating the same results, the same belief systems, that those are actually cleaned, they're cleared. And that a new pathway is actually created. And in that new pathway, there's a new possibility. There's a new way of being. There's a new way of seeing. There's a new way of relating to the world. There's a rebirth. And so again, the final act is closing and then opening to this new possibility. And this is where then maybe some of you have heard this idea of integration comes in. How do I take all of this that I've learned, all of this that I've seen, and then how do I integrate that back into this reality, because this is the reality where we live most of our lives. And so how do we take that dream state, that altered state of consciousness, all that we've learned, and bring it into this reality? Because this is where the actual change happens. And that can present a whole nother level of opportunities, of challenges, of trials and errors. And that's something that we will get to in another episode with someone who works in integration and who is very good in that. So that will be probably in 2 episodes from now. So I think we're over an hour, so I'll stop there. Apologies for any lighting or sound. This is being shot from the Amazon jungle, so it's pretty amazing that any of this is actually able to happen to any degree. And the next episode is actually going to be with 2 of my colleagues here. We're the final people left in this entire COVID situation. So we're going to be talking a bit with them about their stories, what brought them to this work. One is a facilitator here, one is a teacher, so also 2 different perspectives. So seeing their stories, their views on medicine, what it's meant for them, how it's changed them. And then I think also talking a bit about the situation with the coronavirus and how we've experienced it here in Peru. I think, I could be wrong in this, but I think Peru has actually been the longest and most strictly locked down country in the entire world. So it's been quite an interesting journey with that as well. So that will be episode number 2. So thank you guys so much, and I'll leave you with that. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the first podcast. I don't know a lot about this, but I do know with the algorithms through all of these platforms, if you're able to take 5 minutes and leave a starred rating and just leave a very short review, that would really help to get this show out and to get it exposed more. So if you do that, that would be a big help. I also created a Patreon account, and if you're able to give anything, that would be super deeply appreciated. A lot of us here on the ground doing this work, because of all the lockdowns, we've been without work now for, I think, 4 months and potentially another 4 or 5 months to go. So I think we're all trying to come up with creative ways, and this is one way that I think would be really beneficial to really share this information, because I don't see a lot of people who have a really deep understanding of this work having a voice. And so if I'm able to do that, it would be a real honor, and I hope everyone can really benefit from that. So if you're able to give in any way, that would be deeply, deeply appreciated. And also, if you have any comments, leave them in the comment section, or I'll put a link up with an email address too. Any suggestions you have, and anything you'd like to learn about, I would really appreciate that. So any questions you have, any topics you'd like to hear, leave a message, and I'll do shows where I address those questions. That makes it much easier for me, because it gives me a direction of what you all are actually interested in hearing and learning about. So thank you guys, and I will see you on the next episode.